The year was 1885, and in the Arizona Territory, the dust was a living thing. It coated the sills of St. Jude's orphanage for girls with a fine red powder, settled in the folds of their grey wool frocks, and worked its way into the lungs until every breath felt gritty. For Esther, the dust was the taste of loneliness. At 17, she had been at St. Jude's for nearly a decade, long enough for the memories of her parents to become thin and fragile, like pressed flowers in a forgotten book. What remained of them was a hollow ache in her chest and a small, leather-bound journal filled with her mother's delicate sketches of desert flora. Life within the orphanage's adobe walls was a landscape of its own, as stark and unforgiving as the mesas that stood sentinel on the horizon. The days were measured by the sharp clap of Matron Shaw's hands, a sound that could curdle milk. The routine was a relentless metronome of chores, prayers, and thinly veiled contempt. The matron, a woman whose charity had long since soured into resentment, saw the girls not as souls to be nurtured, but as burdens to be managed. Esther, with her quiet nature and eyes that seemed to hold the vast, sorrowful expanse of the sky, was a particular target for the matron's sharp-edged words. She was too quiet, too distant, a constant, silent accusation of a world that had failed her. Her stasis was a carefully constructed fortress of silence. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision that offered no purchase for criticism, her movements economical and her face a mask of placid obedience. Inside, however, she lived in the world her mother had drawn. She memorized the names of plants, the stubborn creosote, the night-blooming cereus, the datura with its poisonous beauty. The book was her only inheritance, a testament to a life that had once held gentleness and wonder. It was a private language, a secret garden cultivated in the barren soil of her existence. This quiet resignation was her shield, a way to endure the unendurable until the day she turned 18 and would be cast out into the world, a prospect that was both a terror and a sliver of hope. The punishment that set everything in motion was for an offense so minor it was barely real. A dropped spoon during the evening meal, clattering on the stone floor like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Matron Shaw's eyes, small and hard as river pebbles, had fixed on her. The sentence was not the switch, but something worse in that parched land, a long walk. Esther was to fetch water from the old willow spring, a 2-mile trek into the arid wilderness, a task designed to exhaust and isolate. She set out just after dawn, 2 heavy wooden buckets chafing her hands, the sun already a hot weight on her shoulders. The landscape was a study in beige and ochre, the earth cracked and thirsty. She walked along the bed of a dry arroyo, its sandy bottom a pale ribbon winding through the scrub. The silence here was different from the silence of the orphanage. It was vast and alive, humming with the unseen life of the desert. It did not press down, it expanded, making her feel both infinitesimally small and strangely free. It was a sound that broke the stillness, so faint at first she thought it was a bird, a low, guttural moan, like the earth itself was in pain. It came again, closer this time, from around a bend in the arroyo where a cluster of tamarisk grew thick and green, signaling the presence of underground moisture. Caution was stitched into the very fabric of an orphan's soul. The world was filled with dangers, and Matron Shaw's dire warnings about the Navajo, whom she called godless savages, echoed in her mind. But the sound was one of pure desperation, a note of suffering that bypassed prejudice and went straight to the heart. Esther set down the heavy buckets, her hands raw and red. She moved forward slowly, her worn boots making no sound in the soft sand. As she rounded the bend, she saw him. An old Navajo man was sunk to his chest in a patch of wet, shimmering sand. It was Quicksand, a hidden trap fed by the same subterranean seep that nourished the tamarisk. His face, a beautiful topography of deep-hewn lines, was contorted with exhaustion. His eyes were closed, his silver hair matted with sweat and sand. He was no longer struggling, a sign he had given up hope. For a long moment, Esther was frozen by a fear colder than any winter night at the orphanage. Every instinct screamed at her to run back to the sterile safety of Sententa Bleng. Every Deus motria basses nos, G's night is nine. Jude's, back to the predictable cruelty of the matron. To help this man was to invite a wrath she could not fathom. He was everything she had been taught to fear and despise. But as she looked at him, sinking slowly into the earth, she did not see a savage. She saw a human being at the precipice of death, his quiet surrender a mirror of the despair she knew so well. In that moment, the world of Matron Shaw and her bitter rules fell away, leaving only the sun, the sand, and a life that needed saving. The initial moments were a frantic, silent ballet of desperation. Words were useless. The old man, whose name she would later learn was Hosteen, watched her with weary, half-open eyes, his breathing shallow. Esther's mind raced, not with the matron's catechisms, but with the practical, earthy knowledge from her mother's book. Not the flowers, but the roots. The way a mesquite's roots anchored it deep in the ground, a lesson in leverage and stability. Her eyes scanned the arroyo. A deadfall of sun-bleached cottonwood lay 50 yards away, its branches brittle but long. She scrambled over the rocks, her hands grabbing at a thick, sturdy limb. It was heavy, almost too much for her to drag, the rough bark tearing at her palms. She grunted with the effort, hauling it back to the edge of the quicksand, her own breath coming in ragged bursts. She was no longer a frail orphan, she was a force of will, fueled by a sudden, fierce determination. "Here," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. She pushed the branch out over the sand, nudging it toward his hands. Hosteen's eyes opened fully. They held no surprise, only a flicker of something ancient and knowing. He gathered the last of his strength, his gnarled fingers closing around the wood. He was too weak to pull himself, his body a dead weight in the sucking mire. Esther lay flat on the stable ground, spreading her weight as she had seen animals do near uncertain waterholes. She dug her fingers into the dry earth, finding purchase, and began to pull. It was a grueling, torturous process. The sand fought her, a greedy mouth unwilling to release its meal. Her muscles screamed, her shoulders felt as if they were being torn from their sockets. Sweat stung her eyes, mingling with the dust on her face to create streaks of mud like war paint. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The branch creaked, and she feared it would snap. Hosteen's grip faltered. She could see the life draining from his face. "No," Esther said, the word a raw command. "Hold on." She repositioned her grip, her mind going back to a drawing in her mother's book, a diagram of a simple lever. She shifted her weight, using a rock as a fulcrum, and pulled not with her arms, but with her entire body, a slow, rhythmic heave. Inch by agonizing inch, the sand began to yield. A horrible slurping sound broke the silence as the seal was broken. He was moving. Hope, bright and sharp, surged through her. With a final, desperate cry that was torn from the deepest part of her, she hauled him clear. He collapsed onto the solid bank, a heap of wet sand and bone-deep weariness, gasping for air. Esther scrambled to his side, her own body trembling with exertion. She uncorked her water canteen, the one she carried for herself, and lifted his head gently, letting the precious liquid trickle past his lips. He drank greedily, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he had taken his fill, he sagged back against the ground, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Life was returning. He lay there for a long time, recovering his strength while Esther sat beside him, the abandoned water buckets forgotten. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude. Finally, he sat up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at her, and his eyes were not just thankful. They were searching, analytical, as if he were reading the story of her soul. His gaze fell upon her dress. It was a plain, grey thing, patched and faded, but on the hem of the sleeve, her mother had stitched a small, intricate pattern of beads, 4 triangles pointing inward to a central circle. She had told Esther it was a pattern of protection, given to her by a kind Navajo woman who had helped her when she was lost long ago. Esther had always cherished it as a secret link to her mother's past. Hostein's breath caught. He reached out a trembling hand, his finger tracing the beaded design. A look of utter astonishment, of profound recognition, dawned on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. The questions in his eyes were vast and deep, but he withheld them. He spoke instead in a low, raspy voice, first in the melodic cadences of his own tongue, then in halting English. "The earth tried to take me," he said, his voice like stones rubbing together. You did not let it." "You were thirsty," Esther replied simply, as if that explained everything. He pushed himself to his feet, still unsteady. He was a man of great dignity, and even in his disheveled state, he stood tall. He gave her one last, long look, a look that held the weight of unspoken histories and unforeseen futures. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat of the desert from which he had come. Esther watched him go, a strange sense of loss mixing with the relief. She was alone again, but the silence felt different now, charged with meaning. It was only then that she noticed the sun was high in the sky. She was hours late. The thought of Matron Shaw sent a jolt of real fear through her, colder and sharper than the fear she had felt at the edge of the quicksand. The fury that greeted her was biblical. Matron Shaw stood on the orphanage steps, her arms crossed, her face a thundercloud. The water buckets, which Esther had eventually remembered and filled, were ripped from her hands. "Where have you been, girl?" The matron's voice was a whip crack. "Look at you, filthy, wasting the day away while decent folk work." Esther, exhausted to her core, could not find the words to explain. An old man, Quicksand, a life saved. The story sounded fantastical even in her own mind. It would sound like a lie, a wild and disrespectful fabrication to the matron. I fell," she stammered, offering a fragment of the truth. "In the arroyo." "Fell," Matron Shaw sneered, her disbelief a palpable force. She grabbed Esther's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You are muddy and you are late. You have been dawdling. Worse, you have been consorting with them. I can smell the wilderness on you." The filth of the savages. She had seen a distant rider from her window, and her mind, steeped in prejudice, had leaped to the worst conclusion. Esther's silence was taken as confession. The matron's rage escalated. This was not just about tardiness, it was about the defiance of her worldview, the crossing of a line she had drawn between her sterile, ordered domain and the wild, untamable world outside. An orphan girl under her charge had interacted with the very people she considered to be subhuman, a contamination of her authority. "You will learn obedience," the matron declared, her voice low and venomous. "You will learn that our ways are the only ways." The punishment was swift and severe. Esther was dragged not to her dormitory, but to the root cellar. The heavy wooden door, with its thick iron bolt, slammed shut behind her, plunging her into a world of damp, cloying darkness. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. A slice of stale bread and a tin cup of water were shoved through a slot in the door. "2 days of solitude to contemplate your wickedness," the matron's voice announced from the other side. "Perhaps God will see fit to cleanse your soul where I have failed." The bolt slid home with a deafening finality. Esther was utterly alone. The cellar became her world. The first day, she slept, her body succumbing to a bone-deep exhaustion she hadn't fully felt until now. The second day, time began to warp and stretch. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her, and the silence was a roaring in her ears. She ran her fingers over the rough stone walls, tracing the damp mortar lines. She thought of Hostein, wondering if he was safe. The memory of his eyes, filled with that strange, intense recognition, was a single point of light in the suffocating blackness. She thought of her mother's book, left behind in her small dormitory chest, The fear that Matron Shaw might find and destroy it was a cold knot in her stomach. In the cellar, her act of kindness felt like a foolish mistake. It had brought her nothing but pain and punishment. The other girls, she knew, would be shunning her memory, whispering about her transgression, their fear of the matron stronger than any loyalty to a fellow orphan. She was more isolated than ever, not just physically confined, but excised from the only community she had ever known. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of this cold, dark hole, and the hope that had flickered within her during the rescue was all but extinguished, leaving only the familiar, bitter taste of despair. 5 days after she had pulled Hostine from the sand, the sun rose on a morning that felt different. A strange stillness had fallen over the small frontier town that huddled around the orphanage. The air was heavy, expectant. Inside St. Jude's, the morning routine was underway, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath the clatter of bowls and the recitation of prayers. Matron Shaw seemed particularly agitated, her commands even sharper than usual. The arrival began not as a sound, but as a tremor in the earth, a faint, rhythmic vibration that grew steadily stronger. Then came the sound, the soft thunder of dozens of unshod ponies moving as one. The girls in the yard froze, their chores forgotten. Matron Shaw rushed to the gate, her face pale. A column of Navajo riders was approaching. They were not a war party. There were no raised weapons, no cries of aggression. They moved with a solemn, inexorable purpose, their faces proud and unreadable. They were led by a man younger than Hostine, with a warrior's build and the same dignified bearing. His name was Bidziel, and he was Hostine's son. His eyes scanned the orphanage, missing nothing. Among the riders, seated tall on a fine pinto, was Hostine himself, dressed in clean buckskins, his silver hair braided with strips of turquoise leather. They stopped 20 feet from the gate, a silent, imposing delegation that brought the town to a standstill. Windows and doors opened, faces peering out, a mixture of fear and awe gripping the onlookers. Matron Shaw, summoning her courage from a deep well of righteous indignation, stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice tight but unwavering. "This is a house of God. You have no business here. Be gone." Bidziel dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He faced her, his height and presence making her seem small and brittle. "We are not here for you," he said, his English clear and measured, carrying the weight of authority. "We are here for a girl." The matron's face tightened. "Our girls do not consort with your kind. There is no one for you here." 5 days ago, Bidziel continued, his voice resonating in the charged silence, "my father was trapped in the sand of the dry river. He was dying. A girl from this place saved him. She had hair the color of sun-cured hay and eyes like the sky before a storm. She gave him water. She pulled him from the earth." A gasp went through the small crowd of orphans huddled behind the matron. They knew. They had heard the whispers, seen Esther's state when she returned. Matron Shaw's face went from pale to mottled red. She thought they were here for restitution, or worse, for revenge for some imagined slight. "Lies," she spat. "A fantasy. I will not have my charges slandered by such tales." Hostine urged his pony forward. He looked directly at the matron, his gaze piercing her wall of denial. "She wore a dress of grey," he said, his voice softer than his son's but no less powerful. "And on her sleeve was a sign, our sign." He held up his own wrist. Woven into a leather band was the same pattern Esther wore, the 4 triangles pointing to a central circle. "It is the mark of the Sky Watchers clan," Bidziel explained, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces. "A clan we thought had vanished 2 generations ago, when a daughter of our line, White Shell Woman, married an outsider and was lost to us." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. An old prophecy spoke of her return, not her, but her descendant. It said one would be found when our people were in need of a new voice, a new heart. This person would be marked by the sign, and they would prove their spirit not through battle, but through an act of selfless courage saving a life when they had nothing to gain. They would be Nata-Aniai, a leader, one who speaks for the people. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The townsfolk stared, their simple prejudices shattering against the rock of this ancient, profound belief. Matron Shaw's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The idea was too monstrous, too utterly subversive to her ordered world. An orphan, a filthy, disobedient girl, a queen. "We are not here to ask," Bidziel stated, his voice ringing with finality. "We are here to claim what is ours by blood and by destiny. We are here for Esther." At the sound of her name, a commotion came from the side of the building. The scullery maid, a timid girl named Martha, who had sometimes shared a crust of bread with Esther, had unbolted the cellar door. Esther emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her frame thin from 2 days of near starvation. She was bewildered, drawn out by the strange silence and the sound of voices. She saw the riders, saw Hosteen, and then saw the look of pure, unadulterated horror on Matron Shaw's face. She heard the word the man had used, Nata-Aniai. She did not understand its meaning, but she understood the scene before her. On one side stood Matron Shaw and the world of grey walls, cold soup, and constant judgment. On the other stood a people she did not know, their faces stern but their eyes holding something she had never seen directed at her before: reverence. "There she is," Hosteen said, his voice filled with a quiet triumph. Matron Shaw turned on Esther, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Get back inside, you wretched girl. You are nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." But her words had lost their power. They were the desperate shrieks of a tyrant whose reign was ending. Esther looked at the matron, at the orphanage that had been her prison, and then she looked at Hosteen. She saw the man whose life she had saved. She saw Bidziel, who looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a future to be embraced. Slowly, deliberately, Esther took a step forward, and then another. She walked past the sputtering, impotent matron, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. She did not know what a queen was, or what destiny awaited her. She only knew that she was walking away from a life of being nothing, and toward the slim, impossible chance of becoming someone. She stopped before Bidziel and Hosteen, raised her chin, and met their gaze. In the silence of the Arizona morning, she had made her choice. The departure was a quiet, solemn affair that left the town and Matron Shaw in stunned silence. There was no argument left to be made. Esther was allowed to retrieve her single possession, her mother's book of sketches. As she clutched it to her chest, she felt she was carrying her entire history with her into an unknown future. Bidziel helped her onto a gentle mare, his touch respectful and firm. As she looked back one last time at the grim facade of St. Jude's, she felt no sadness, only the release of a great and heavy chain. The journey into the heart of the Dine Bikea, the Navajo lands, was a revelation. The world bloomed from the muted tones of the orphanage into a vibrant tapestry of deep red canyons, soaring mesas, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like a benediction. The land was no longer a threat, a harsh expanse to be endured, but a living entity, beautiful and sacred. Her escort treated her not with fawning subservience, but with a quiet, profound respect that was more comforting than any luxury. They shared their food, pointed out landmarks, and spoke in their soft, musical language, including her in their circle of warmth. During a rest stop under the shade of a magnificent rock formation that looked like a slumbering giant, Hosteen sat with her. He unrolled an old, beautifully woven blanket. There, in the very center, was the pattern from her sleeve, the symbol of the Skywatchers clan. He told her the story of her great-grandmother, a weaver and a dreamer who had fallen in love with a surveyor from the east. When she left with him, the clan had grieved her as lost, but the matriarchs had kept the prophecy alive, a thread of hope woven through the generations. "You did not save only my life in the arroyo, little sister," Hosteen said, his eyes kind. "You saved a story from being forgotten. You brought the lost thread home." Her new life unfolded not in a palace of stone, but among the hogans and the grazing sheep under the endless sky. There was no throne, no crown. The title of Nataani was not one of command, but of counsel. It meant she was a person of wisdom and perspective, someone whose voice would be heard in the council, whose heart was trusted. Her innate resilience, once a survival mechanism, was now seen as strength. Her quiet, observant nature, once a fault, was now seen as wisdom. The knowledge from her mother's book, once a private escape, became a bridge as she learned the DNA names for the plants she knew, connecting her past to her present. She spent her days learning from Hosteen, from Bidziel, and from the clan's matriarchs. She learned to weave, her fingers slowly growing skilled at turning raw wool into patterns that told stories. She learned their language, their history, their ceremonies that honored the balance of the world. She was not a queen who ruled, but a vital part of a community that had made a place for her, a place that had been waiting for her all along. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the cliffs in hues of fire and rose, Esther stood at the edge of a mesa, looking out over the vast, breathtaking expanse. The wind that swept up from the canyon floor no longer howled with loneliness. It whispered stories of resilience, of belonging. She was no longer Esther, the orphan. She was Esther of the Skywatchers clan. The hollow ache in her chest, the one she had carried for as long as she could remember, was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound sense of peace. She had not been rescued to become a queen. She had been rescued to finally, truly, come home.